All right, let's get this party started. Bear with me while I get the screen set up. Okay, cool. So, thanks everybody for joining. My name is Richard Nugent. I am the lead of the HEC-FDA team at the Hydrologic Engineering Center. I appreciate you all joining us to talk about pre-processing 2D hydraulic modeling. This webinar is the first in what we expect to be a quarterly event. During the next webinar, we are going to take a look at identifying index locations and impact areas. The following will introduce HEC-FDA version 2.0, and we're looking at that coinciding with certifications, so probably end of December, beginning of January. In this webinar, we are going to discuss a method for pre-processing 2D hydraulic modeling for import into HEC-FDA. And you can think of this as a manual approach to the pre-processing that was undertaken by GEO-FDA, which has since been retired. Alternatively, you can think about this as an introduction to the pre-processing that HEC-FDA version 2.0 does. In in simple terms, or in simple concepts, we're basically taking a 2D world and we're going to break that 2D world down to make it fit into a 1D world. So before we move on, let's just take a look at the images on the screen. On the top right hand side, you see the way that HEC-FDA version 1.4.3 works. So we have outlined some damage reaches, but HEC-FDA version 1.4.3 only recognizes the streams as specified by river station. And river station, that is the one dimension in HEC-FDA version 1.4.3. So we only see the structures along a one-dimensional line defined by river stations. In the bottom image, we can see structures that are represented by pink dots, which are mapped on top of a floodplain, and that floodplain is represented by the black polygon. We're asking the same question in both images. What is the water surface elevation at the structure? In the top image, in the HEC-FDA 1 world, that is the one-dimensional world, we get that information by interpolating the water surface elevation between two river stations. But in the two-dimensional world, we're going to get that water surface elevation directly from the XY coordinate on that raster. All right, so this is an approach that allows us to improve the fidelity of our inputs. And as I go on, I may not have the chance to monitor chat. We have other folks from the HEC-FDA team on, including Brennan Beam. Brennan, if you wouldn't mind helping me out with chat, and folks who are, if you have questions, I welcome you to just take yourself off mute, ask your questions, and thank you, Brennan. Okay, so the problem we are solving today is this. HEC-FDA was not originally designed to accept 2D or gridded hydraulic data. 2D, that's XY, right? So FDA expects cross sections at the river stations over a given reach within the study area. And this river station is FDA's one-dimensional notion of geography. So FDA just sees a line. And we look at where the structure falls on that line of river stations. Now, HEC-FDA version 2.0 is designed to accept 2D hydraulic modeling, but until version 2.0 is completed and certified, which we're targeting December of this year, we will need to use this method to pre-process 2D hydraulic modeling in HEC-FDA version 1.4.3. So it is this is a cool, I think it's a good opportunity um, to introduce folks who are less experienced with GIS, because again, what we're doing is basically what version 2.0 will do as it computes the aggregated stage damage. So this introduces you to how HECFDA version 2.0 will work if you don't have as much experience with, uh, excuse me, if you don't have much experience with GIS. Okay, let's continue on. So how are we going to do this? The 2D data can be pre-processed using GIS software, and we'll use Excel to organize that data and import it into FDA. The GIS software that we're using for this tutorial is a program called QGIS. QGIS is an open source uh, GIS platform, and it is available for free on the USACE app portal. What we're doing today could just as easily, if not even more easily, be done um, with ArcGIS. So the general process is as follows. First, we're going to redefine river stations to be located at structures. And river stations will no longer have their original interpretation, which was like river miles. In version 1.4.3, the river stations had a relationship such that you could interpolate between them to find the water surface elevation between them, which would typically be at the structures. And that will no longer be the case. All right, each structure is going to have its own river station, which we should think about more like an ID, a numerical identifier for the XY location of the structure. And so the XY location of the structure to the XY location of the water surface elevation value is going to be joined using that ID. Next, we're going to obtain the depth above ground from a 2D raster at a structure for the structure's river station. That is, we're going to take one of 8 sets of data from HEC-RAS, and then we're going to ask that raster, what is the depth at this structure's location? Then we have some additional processing. We will need to revise missing stages, in other words, cells where the depth is 0 to 9 feet below the ground elevation, where the next profile is missing. So if we're thinking about the 2-year, if that's blank, and then the 5 years also blank, then the 2-year will fill with -9. We will instead use -2 where the next profile has flooding. So if we're looking at the 2-year, the 2-year has no flooding, but the 5-year does, then the 2-year will be revised to be -2. Then all we need to do is format the data into the way that HECFDA version 1.4.3 expects, import, and continue on with configuring our study. All right, so the objective, assume we're at that import stage, right? That's the last step here. The objective is to fill out this ASCII text delimited water surface profile import table. And you can see that there are stages with -9 and -2, as we discussed in the last slide. There are a few things I'd like to note about this table. So the water surface elevation is unique to a structure, so that the 8 profiles or 1 row is for one structure only. And again, we're looking at the water surface profile stations more as an ID for the XY location. And we are using the type of water surface profile of stage frequency. We're not going to bother with discharge in the water surface profiles because discharge is only used at the index location. Discharge is not used at the structure. In other words, using the water surface profile type of discharge frequency, that's just a convenience for retrieving the flow frequency and stage flow functions at the index locations. And I'm asking that we set that convenience aside in our minds which data is used for what. So the water surface profile, the data you see here is only used at the structure to develop the structure aggregated stage damage function. And taking a step back, it's only used at a structure to develop the structure stage damage function, which are then aggregated over structures for a given plan, year, stream, reach, and damage category. Okay, so this is the data that we use to calculate at the structure for the aggregated stage damage function. We are using depth grids here. So the data in the water surface profile actually reflects depths across the 8 events, and using depth grids for this manual pre-processing approach is preferred. We've found that avoiding the need to work with a terrain file is gets us a better result when we are doing this kind of manual work. That I don't expect that to be the case when we move to 2.0. And one more note to point out here. So we have depths for the 8 events. When we go to define our flow frequency function and then our stage flow function, we need to use stage, not flow. Okay, so we don't want to have a depth frequency function or a stage depth function. I'm sorry, a depth flow function. We need to define these functions using stage. We'll talk more about those functions toward the end of the presentation. So what is the minimum data that we require? And who is we? I'm thinking about the economists who are going to ask the folks in H&H for some data so that we can use HEC-FDA to carry out a risk assessment. The first thing that we need, so let me back up just a moment. So we're asking for this data from the H&H branch, the H&H division branch, whichever. The data that we're asking for is the data that we need to characterize the hazard, right? If you remember what the risk equation is, it's a function of hazard, performance, and consequences, where consequences is a function of exposure and vulnerability. So what we're trying to do here is process the data, gather and process the data that we need to characterize the hazard. So the minimum data that we need to do that, to characterize the hazard, is hydraulic modeling. So we're going to use depth grids, which are spatially referenced data sets. In other words, if you have an XY location, you can ask it for its depth. We need that for the 8 events. And what spurred all of this? This is really the result of innovations here at HEC in hydraulic modeling so that we are modeling over 2 dimensions instead of 1 dimension. All right, and that is the cause for this webinar and the original impetus for HECFDA version 2.0. We're going to need the hydrologic and hydraulic input relationships at the index location. So we'll need the discharge frequency function, whether that is whether the flows can be described using a log Pearson type 3 distribution or the flows need to be described using a graphical. We will need the flows and we will need the stage discharge function. There is an option to ask for the stage frequency function instead, but the stage frequency function should only be used in very particular situations, such as when stage to discharge is not a one-to-one relationship. But outside, if the stage to discharge function can be represented as one-to-one, in other words, it is a function, then we really want to use discharge frequency and stage discharge. Finally, we're going to need the structure inventory as a point shape file. So we'll need a geo-referenced data set for the structure inventory that will include the XY location of the structure, and it will include all of the structure attributes, the ones that we're used to, the structure value, the content value, or the structure ID, so on and so forth. Typical structure inventory, it's just in a different format. All right. So these are our 3 data requirements. Number 1 and 2, we will be working with the H&H engineers to obtain. So I want to spend some time doing some review so that we understand what this data is going to be used for. So let's think about the 2 primary functions of HEC-FDA. That really are just 2, right? The first is to compute aggregated stage damage. And then the second is to run risk assessment simulations. In other words, calculate EAD. So to carry out that first function, we're going to need a structure inventory with occupancy types. We need that hydraulic data set. So that is the data that we're going to be processing today. And we need the discharge frequency and stage discharge with uncertainty so we can identify the range of stages at the index location for which we will calculate damage, and thus the same relative range of stations at the relative range of stages, or in our case, depths at the structure's location. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the stage damage. We are linking the structure to the water, and we're linking structure damage to how much water there is, right? And that's the stage damage function. And today we are focusing on where we get the flood water surface elevation, right? That is the input to the identification of the depth of water over first floor. So we're going to need to connect the water surface elevation that's in the raster value to the structure and bring that into FDA. So this is really the only place that data we're working on comes into play. We use the water surface elevation to identify the depth of water over the first floor for the 8 events. And the idea is to do that with uncertainty. Now let's look at the second primary function, that is to combine a sampled discharge frequency with a sampled stage discharge and a sampled stage damage to produce a realization of the damage frequency function, which is then integrated to produce a realization of EAD. And to do this, we need really just 3 functions. There are some optional functions, but 3 functions to calculate EAD with uncertainty. And that is a discharge frequency with uncertainty, a stage discharge with uncertainty, and a stage damage with uncertainty. So let's remember how we combine these things. We will have those 3 items that we just mentioned, that we have the flow frequency, the stage flow, the stage damage. We'll sample the flow frequency function, we'll sample the stage flow function, we'll sample the stage damage function, we'll combine those 3 into a damage exceedance probability function. We will integrate, which gives us 1 realization of EAD. But note that this is not the final estimate of EAD. We need to calculate EAD with uncertainty. This case is just 1 step in that calculation. So let's look at how we carry through that compute so that we can assess risk with uncertainty. Here's the first realization. That is the curve that you saw on the last slide. we're going to be sampling those functions many, many times, keeping track of the running average of EAD until that running average no longer changes by much, at which point the simulation has converged. All of this to say where the data is being used, the data we're working on today, and that's in the stage damage function on the lower left-hand corner. Okay. All right. So let's actually get into processing the data. Now, the first step is going to be to import the hydraulic data into your GIS software. Each water surface profile is going to be imported as an individual layer. That is typically how they come from HEC-RAS. So that 8 layers will represent the hydraulic data in total. In QGIS, this is done by dragging the raster file, and typically it's going to be a VRT, .VRT file. You're going to drag the .VRT file into the map window from the QGIS file browser. The raster may be a single TIFF, or it may be a VRT that stitches together many TIFFs. Observe in this animation, we are dragging the VRT file for the 0.01 AEP event from the file browser on the left into the map window on the right. We give the layer a helpful name because the layer is going to have the name of the VRT, which is the same. It's either depth max or water surface elevation max. So we want to rename this to tell us what event this represents. And you can see in the map window the event being displayed. The next step is to import the structure inventory. So we have imported our 8 profiles into the GIS software. Now we're going to bring our structure inventory into the GIS software. And this is done the same way. We're going to find our structure inventory shapefile, click on it, drag it into the map window. And then you'll see on the bottom left-hand side, the layers, among the layers is the structure inventory. And once we've dragged them in, you can see that the structures are represented by green dots here. Now, recall that our objective is to get the water surface elevations at each of the structures in the inventory. So we have the water surface elevation layers and the structure inventory layer in the software. And we're using depths in this case, not water surface elevations, excuse me. So we have the depth grids and the structure inventory in the GIS software. Now we're just going to pull out the necessary information from those depth grids, that is the depths at those XY locations, by sampling raster values. So what does sampling raster values mean? It means that we take a point shape file in a single raster and obtain the raster value, that is the depth, at that structure's location. So in essence, this process creates a new shapefile for each hydraulic profile with the water surface with the depths at each structure. In QGIS, we are running this as a batch process so that we can run the process against all 8 profiles at the same time. So let's take a look at how this occurs. We'll start once this animation restarts. We are almost to the end. So the shapefile that gets produced will have all of the attributes of the structure inventory, and then there will be one more attribute under the field R value 1, and R value 1 is the sampled raster value. All right, so we are starting. We're going to find the sample raster values under the raster analysis tool. We are going to define our layers that we are going to use. The input point layers, the structure inventory, and then we're going to select that for all of the rows. So we just copy and paste. And then we need to identify the raster layer to sample. The raster layer to sample, we have 8 for the 8 different profiles. So we need to select all, and each of those selections will be assigned to a row. The final thing before we run is to identify a folder to save the points to, and give the points a helpful file name. We're going to save as type shapefile, and so we'll give we do not want to autofill. We'll give each row, in other words, each set of sampled points, a useful name, so that would include the event they represent. We'll click run, and once we've run, what this produces 8 shapefiles, each with the structure inventory attributes and the raster value. So the next step is to go find those shapefiles where you saved them and drag those shapefiles into the map window. They will show up in the layers panel, and we'll be ready to move on to the next step. Okay, so the next step is to compile all this data in one place so that we can export it. What we're going to do is combine the data in the 8 shapefiles into just one shapefile using the join process. We'll join the data in the attribute table with the data in another attribute table, and we're going to do this on structure ID. Recall that each shapefile has the structure attributes in addition to the raster value. And so each shapefile has the structure ID and the depth at that structure. So we're going to basically just ask for the raster values in all of the shapefiles and add them to we'll ask for the raster values across 7 shapefiles and add those to the 8th shapefile. Then we'll just copy and paste into Excel. So let's look at this, how to do this in QGIS. So recall that we had just pulled the shapefiles into the map window. Now what we're going to do is go to the 2-year, go to properties, and then find joins, which is that little circle and a triangle. We want to add joins to this, so we're going to join the structure inventory to, with the join layer, we're going to go to the next event. So if we're at the 5-year, now it looks like we're going to the 10-year. We're joining on the structure ID, and then we want to give a custom field name prefix, something that will help us identify the joined layer from the other joined layers, the joined column from the other joined columns. We're going to do this for all the layers. So we started with the 2-year, and basically we're copying in the raster values from the 5th year to the 500-year into the 2-year. So that we have all that data in one shapefile. Now we're going to go to the attributes for that shapefile. We're going to press Control A to select all cells, Control C to copy those cells, and we're just going to paste them into an Excel workbook. Once we're in the Excel workbook, we have a few more steps. So hang in there. All right, so we just got our data in Excel, and the image on the screen shows what the data will look like once you've pasted that data in Excel. The next step is going to be processing the depths. So we have some manual data work to be done here. Notice that the data copied from QGIS, that can be found in columns A through S. Columns A through L, those were the attributes in the 2-year sampled points file. L is the sampled point for the 2-year, right? The structure inventory, the structure attributes are in columns A through K. Then in columns M through S, those are the joined columns that were joined on structure ID, which is named a PN number in this example. So the first manual data cleaning that we're going to need to do is make sure that the events are in order of decreasing frequency, right? This is how we see it in the HEC-FDA import file. And so let's get a head start on getting that data to reflect that. Okay. So now that our events are in decreasing order of frequency, we need to fill in columns that don't have any data. So HEC-RAS is not going to report a depth for a given grid cell if that cell is dry. And you see that in the table for station 1, the cell is dry for the 2-year up to the 10-year. So we need to put some data in there. HEC-FDA gets mad if you don't put data in your water surface profiles. And really we can enter values that give us an accurate result. A more accurate than leaving these things blank. There is an invert here, but we don't need the invert because we're not going to retrieve our flow frequency and stage flow functions from the water surface profiles. So we don't need the invert, you can leave that out. Now what we need to do is enter -9 for all depths that are 0, except for the event that is followed by an event that sees a positive depth. And in that case, we're going to enter -2. So using a depth of -9 feet ensures that no damage will be calculated at that structure for the stage damage relationship and expected annual damage. Use -9, that is just a value that's well below the start of most damage functions and outside the scope for calculations with uncertainty. So using -9 and then -2, that helps us to get a good interpolation between the 10-year and 25-year. Where -9 used for all 3 cells, there exists a potential to underestimate damages, right? Because that interpolation is going to be more steep. Okay, it is time to populate data in cells with 0 depths. We're going to add 1 column for each of the events. The depth of the first profile, which we see after the invert, which is in this example, the 2-year, is replicated using an equation equals if, so it's a long equation, but we see that at the start of the animation, there's the equation, and this equation is in the tutorial. This equation or this statement is dragged over the 8 events and performs a couple of different procedures. So that statement, that equation, performs a number of if statements. So if the current profile has an estimated depth, then the processed depth is equal to the estimated depth. If the current profile, in addition to the following profile and decreasing frequency, do not have an estimated depth, then we set the process depth equal to -9. If the current profile does not have an estimated depth, but the following profile does, then set the depth to -2. So we're doing this over the first 7 events here. You can see we're doing this through the at the 200 year. So 2-year to the 200, we need to handle the last column uniquely. So the depth of the last profile, which in this example is the 500 year, is processed using a similar statement, that will check if the last profile has an estimated depth, in which case the depth will equal the estimated depth. If the last profile does not have an estimated depth, then we'll set the depth to -9. And again, that equation is given in the tutorial. The final step in processing the data manually that we've exported from QGIS is to assign the structures a river station. The easiest way to do this is just use integers starting at 1, which you can see that's what we did on the screen. We gave the structure in column 2 a station number of 1, and then just drag that down so that each structure has a unique station number, and that station number is going to act like an ID for the XY location. We need to keep this file handy because this file is gives us the relationship between structure ID and station number. And these station numbers you're going to need to enter into your structure inventory. Now, for studies that have multiple reaches, you will need to use the SID reaches because there's probably going to be some overlap. Now, one more point on processing this data. Here we skipped checking for monotonicity, right? You're also seeing that there's a monotonicity check here in the water surface profiles. We can skip it as long as we are not retrieving our flow frequency functions and stage flow functions from the water surface profiles. The only time that we need that monotonicity is for the input functions. And because we're going to define those functions separate from our water surface profiles, we don't need to check for monotonicity. All right. Next, we're going to organize our data as the FDA ASCII template asks, right? So you have those headers that are in row 5. We have headers in row 1 with the header value. This is the typical template, which you can get at the tutorial page. You can see that we have water surface profile station in the column A, which again represents basically an XY location. That's an ID for an XY location. So we're ready to import, right? Because we have our stage frequency water surface profile. Recall that this was our objective, right? And so we've met our objective. We created this water surface profile text input file. We import the usual way, economics import ASCII tab delimited, and voila. You have imported 2D hydraulic modeling into HEC-FDA version 1.4.3. But wait, there's more. So I just want to touch on a couple additional points that are not necessarily unique to 2D modeling, but are a helpful review. We need to specify the damage reaches and the index locations. The damage reaches should include the structures, should be defined by the river stations in which the structures, oh gosh, why is that a hard sentence? So each damage reach is going to have a number of structures, and you'll need the min river station and max river station among those structures to identify the reach, the upstream and downstream stations. And recall, because the river stations no longer have that interpretation of river miles, that these upstream, downstream, it doesn't really have much significance. If you have just a one reach study, then you're done, right? You can put the index location, and so we're using an index location of 0.01 so that it's a separate station from the structures. But as long as you have just one reach, you identify these three values and you're done. If you have multiple reaches, you're going to have the possibility that there's overlap. And what do I mean by overlap? Well, in this reach, we have stations between 0.01 and 13,836. Assume we have another reach with a structure station. The minimum structure station is like 10,000, right? Then you have overlap between the 10,000 and the 13,000, right? There's about an overlap of like almost 4,000 stations. So FDA won't know in which damage reach to put that structure because that station resides within both damage reaches. So what in the channel. So we've defined our reaches and I expanded the scope of our objective in which was to characterize the hazard, right? One objective was to put together that water surface profile import file. The overarching objective was to characterize the hazard. So now that we have imported our water surface profiles, we're going to need to define the flow frequency and the stage flow functions. And so we need to ask the H&H engineers for data on the flows, the flow distribution, and data on the stage flow. In this case, we have the table on the left, which has probability, stage, and flow. We can enter probability and flow as a graphical flow frequency function, and then we can enter stage and flow for our stage discharge function. Now that we have entered the flow frequency and the stage flow functions, we have fully characterized the hazard. Now, it is possible that you have other relationships, but this is the minimum set of relationships you need. From there, you continue as usual. Include other H&H data. You may include levies, regulated, unregulated relationships, exterior, interior relationships. You'll import your structure, inventory, and occupancy types, compute aggregated stage damage, evaluate the plans by analysis here. The rest is the same. So all of this was just to get the water surface elevation at a structure's location, connect them using an ID, which we call river station, and import the water surface elevation for that station into FDA. That's the gist of it. Now, I went fast enough to leave some time for questions. And let me point out quickly that on this slide, and I'm going to send out the slides with the YouTube link to this recording. If you have questions and you'd like to skip out, or you don't want to ask here, you can post your questions to our discourse discussion board. That's at that link, and this tutorial is available at the bottom link with other tutorials. All right. So I see that chat was really busy, which is Makes me happy to see. Sounds like folks are engaged, which is great. Are there questions that we can talk about from chat, or does anybody else have questions?
Yeah, this is Sarah Mattingly in Louisville. I just wanted to clarify. Were you saying that we prefer depth grids now, but when it comes time to using FDA 2.0, we should be using water surface elevation grids?
Yes and no. So
Okay.
we do prefer, we encourage rather using depth grids so that you don't have to try to obtain ground elevations from terrain files. We found that when we were doing that, there were differences in resolution that were giving us results that weren't real intuitive. And so using the depth grids, we can avoid the terrain file. But Brennan is doing a lot of really great work um, using some of the RAS tools to relate the water surface elevations to the terrain. So in that case, I wouldn't say that there is a preference for water surface elevations, just that we will be able to handle water surface elevations just as well as depth grids with version 2.0.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. What else, folks? If someone could help me, if your question was not, I saw some defer to Richard. So does anybody have a question that was deferred to me? Chat's kind of long. I don't want to go into reading that during our time. Who had a question? Come off mute. Let's talk. Making me feel lonely.
Yeah, I'll come off mute. This is Justin Brewer, and yeah, like Peter's responding to me right now. But I guess yeah, just for anyone who hasn't done a lot of this, I've the times I have done this, I've only actually used water surface elevation grids, and yeah, Peter, I'm talking kind of about the grids and getting the 8 events right now as opposed to the index stations. But it's kind of the whole point of this is making this stuff fit into FDA, which was kind of set up to work a certain way. And so, like in my brain, making everything kind of flow the way I think or feel FDA kind of intended it to. I like having that terrain, that foundation height, the first floor elevation, using the water surface, saying this is the stage, and then kind of when I pull out like the struct detail and look at the individual structure data, the way the depths are calculated, for whatever reason, probably just because I got used to the way I ran FDA for years and years using like text import files of 1D hydraulics. I tend to prefer using water surface elevation grids. I would tell anyone if you feel like you would like that more, I don't think there's any reason you can't use it. And I think it really is a personal preference thing. Yeah.
Thanks, Justin. And you were sort of hinting at kind of a big picture thing here, and that is that we have described just one way of doing this. There are many different ways that folks in the field have been doing for some time, right? We were able to connect with Dean McLeod, who helped us to write up this tutorial, but folks have been doing this independently different ways, and so we recognize that this is just one way. And I want to add that I also like to work with water surface elevations. I like to have terrain and foundation height, and that was our original attempt. It may be just an idiosyncrasy of this particular software, but there was a disconnect in resolution in between the terrain and the water surface elevation files that we were using that gave us funny results, and so that's why we just moved away from water surface elevations. But if you are in particular using different software or a different approach, then it may not be an issue.
Right. Yeah, that totally makes sense to me. And yeah, even within our own district, within Omaha, we have people that prefer different ways. Some people like depth, some people like water surface elevation. So just throwing it out there for anyone who was concerned if they were in the middle of working on something where they were getting water surface elevation grids.
Thanks, Justin.
And just to add to the to justify why we used depths when we did it rather than water surface elevations. The actual this inconsistency that Richard's hinted at a couple times. When you use a terrain from RAS, RAS will stitch together a bunch of different resolution terrains and use them in the hydraulic computations at their full resolution. But if you take that terrain from RAS and add it to a GIS software, just using that VRT, it homogenizes the resolution. What you're seeing on your screen is all a consistent resolution. So if you have some terrain that is 10 meter and some terrain that is 1 meter, they're going to get averaged, or they're going to get processed so that they are the same, and you lose some consistency there. And that's just the nature of GIS. And in our study, the little change there from that resolution was giving us monotonicity problems. The terrain was unreasonably high in a couple spots or unreasonably low just because the resolution was screwed up. And that's why we decided to just use depth grid, so we didn't run into that issue. But so if that's something that comes up, that's why we did it. Hopefully you never run into it. People have been doing it other ways without running into that issue. And that's great. But that was the impetus for us using depth grids rather than water surface elevation grids.
Thank you, Brennan.
Betcha.
Any other questions, folks? Any doubts? Is there something that you'd like to go over again? I flew through that, and
Hey, Richard, this is Grace.
Hi, Grace.
I was wondering about the monotonicity portion. So you mentioned that you don't need to do that check on your water surface profiles. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. That's
okay.
correct.
So even if you had like a structure that didn't have any water on it until like the 500-year event, you could have -9s across the board with no problem.
That's correct.
Okay.
And I would encourage encourage the check more as validation on the data that either we've manually processed. Well, that's the most likely situation, that you don't have something real funny going on, because you are using this to, well, so stage probability is a cumulative distribution function, right? And so it doesn't make sense for stage to go down as frequency goes down, because we are accumulating probability, right? So a non-monotonic stage frequency function at the stage does not make sense, but FDA will not complain very loudly if there is some non-monotonicity.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Richard, this is Nick.
Hey, Nick.
There was some discussion in the chat about -2 being a 0 damage point, and economists should make sure that that's true with their depth damage curves. Can you speak to that a little bit more, and especially because the EGM curves, I think with basements, damage can start around like -8 feet or so. So can you expand a little bit on that discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that it does help with the 0 damage point. Though so if you have a basement, right, that can go and it's like so a res 1-1 with basement. Depth does start, I think it's at 7 feet, negative 7 feet, right? Negative 8 feet is the 0% damage. The typical situation is that you're going to have a beginning damage depth. And that's going to define the point at which the structure starts seeing damage. It doesn't make a ton of sense to me to have a structure with a basement without beginning damage. Because in that case, yeah, the -2 and between the -9 and the -2, you're going to be saying that the structure is getting damaged, but it's not. So that depth percent damage function, it goes down to -8, right, to reflect the basement being filled, but typically we only think about the basement being filled until the water reaches the beginning damage. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Yeah, I'm not sure either because it wasn't my original question, but I think it's an interesting one because I mean we've talked about before, like, oh, how do we ensure that there's no damage being done due to these kind of negative, damage curves in here, and FDA kind of treating it as water surface elevation and first floor elevation versus ground elevation plus foundation height and stuff like that. So it did raise a red flag for me, and I think Michael was kind of speaking this in the chat, and it sounded like people had some suggestions. Just thought it should be raised, and maybe that's is the -2 a mandatory thing? If you do use the EGM curve with basement starting lower, should you change that -2 to a different number, like -8, or should you modify your depth damage curves, or is this just not a problem at all?
So what I would say is that this is not a problem at all, as long as you're using a good beginning damage. Like that is the requirement, that you have a good beginning damage. So the -2, it only matters for the interpolation. It should not matter at all for the structure stage damage. You're not going to see damage happening at a depth of 2 feet below the ground, right? That's not happening. So if water starts entering the basement the moment the water touches the foundation, so if we're thinking about 1/10 of an inch, then you would want to use a beginning damage equal to the ground elevation, right? And in that case, the -2 is still not a problem. So the point here with the -2 is that you have a reasonable interpolation. If you think about interpolating between -2 and 0, or -2 and perhaps 3, you'll have a much flatter slope than you would if you were -9 and 3. And so if you have a flatter slope, it's a more accurate representation of damage for a given stage between those events. So
Thank
does
you.
that make sense, right? So it's -2
so, yeah.
is cool. Negative, just to summarize, because I may have confused myself walking through that. Using -2 is not a problem. You just need to have a good beginning damage, and you should have a good beginning damage anyway, right? So -2 will not play into damage at the structure as long as you have a good beginning damage point. Any other questions, folks?
Yeah, this is
Okay.
Mike. So yeah,
Sure.
I think you discussed that issue. I was the one who put that in the chat. But as far as the beginning damage point, that's an optional, the program will compute it, but it's optional to actually enter that into the system. So I think what you're recommending is to be sure and include that.
Yeah, it is optional, but using depths this way, I would say it's required. Otherwise, you'll get a weird result. So if you're using depths, you're using the -9, the -2, you just need to use a good beginning damage.
Okay.
Or rather, that's the way that you can get around the possibility of calculating damage where depth is below the ground. All right, folks, any more questions? Cool. Well, thank you all for joining. I will have a recording of this webinar along with the slides sent out to you all. I'll send out to the everybody on the event. And looking forward to the next webinar when we will talk about index points and impact areas. Thanks, folks. Have a great day.